Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. I am Rob Farley from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Sean Kay, who has been with us once before. Sean, remind me where you work and what you do.
My home base is at Ohio Wesleyan University, and I have an affiliation also as an associate at the Mershon Center at the Ohio State University, and an affiliation at the Eisenhower Institute in Washington as well.
Okay. We've had
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, we've had a couple other over the years. We've had a couple other Mershon affiliates because we had Pete Mansour on here and we had John Mueller.
Sure. Excellent.
So it's a great place to
It's a wonderful, wonderful program. I'm very fortunate to be part of it.
Right. Also, fans of Foreign Entanglements, I need to apologize for our absence over the past couple of months. We are, for some reason, for both Matt and myself, we get ridiculously busy around this time, and we haven't been able to put together. There were a couple technical problems too, but we haven't been able to put together any vlogs lately. So, our apologies. But fortunately, the international system always gives us something to talk about. So, you today, or a few days ago, had an op-ed about a conversation that is really taking over Twitter today and has been taking over the op-ed pages for the last few days, which is this question of whether or not the United States ought to facilitate the transfer of lethal arms to Ukraine in order to fight back against Russian-supported separatists in the eastern part of the country. And it's fair to say you're on the negative side of that question.
Yes. Yeah. This sort of started, there has been some argument about arming Ukraine really going on for some months, but it of course, really took a significant leap forward with a report from the Brookings Institution last week, which came out on Monday, that laid out the case for, in effect, using the supply of some relatively limited defensive, as they said, weapons to Ukraine, primarily to raise the costs to Russia on the belief that that would lead it to negotiate.
Right.
Yeah, and so my critique of that is that the study itself was fairly one-sided coming out of Brookings. It really did not, and when you dig into it, tease out perhaps what happens next. It didn't give any real acknowledgement to the potential concerns that could come with a policy like this. There are several key issues that at least I tried to bring to the table that I felt at least have to be part of this discussion. The first and foremost, I think, is that we're talking about putting America and its military capabilities 300 miles away from the capital of Russia, which I would argue is a weak state that is currently acting unpredictably and has a lot of nuclear weapons. And so, as a general rule, that ought to frame the discussion first and foremost.
A lot of nuclear weapons and also vast reservoirs of paranoia.
And they have internalized that, in terms of thinking about NATO and the West and whatnot. I'm actually a little less concerned about that. I think it's an important part of the debate. But the other key element of this is that it's unclear that the weapons being talked about would get there in time to make a difference, or even then could make a difference. In the interim period, Russia holds all the cards in terms of sort of an escalation spiral, as some people call it. And then finally, the third key element of my concern was that, and I do believe this is borne out, which is that I think that the center of gravity for the West in this is the cohesion of the Western alliance. Once we lose that, then our asymmetrical vulnerabilities become significant, which is that Putin can look to divide the allies, see these allies fighting with each other, and actually start to pick away things on sanctions or EU or NATO consensus. And I was concerned that this would blow up very quickly with allies in strong disagreement over this issue. And I think that has happened. I mean, we've seen the Germans make it very clear that this is not a policy that they even see as a good cop, bad cop approach. They have made clear that they believe this is not constructive is the word that was used. And then also the British have signaled they're opposed to it, and so have the French.
The French were only recently convinced not to ship weapons to Russia.
Weapons themselves to the Russians, yeah. So I'm curious to know what you think. I mean, the weapons themselves actually would they make any kind of tactical difference? That's an important element. And also, I would ask you what you think in terms of, part of this assumes that Putin behaves in a certain way, brings up important questions of rational actor models and even sort of linear or mirror imaging on our own part.
Well, no, so the weapons themselves, well, they were talking about, I know, counter battery radars, which were, designed to be helpful in terms of allowing Ukraine to exercise air power, which has been a problem. Armored personnel carriers. I think that there were. What were some of the other ones? Do you remember?
Drones,
drones for surveillance,
communications, command and control infrastructure, things like that.
Right. I guess just to talk about one objection before I get to, and I'm a little bit more ambivalent about this question than you are, I think. People have made this point a few times, which is that we as Americans tend to over-technologize warfare. We tend to concentrate way too much on the material aspects. And what we have in the Ukrainian military and what's sort of become clear over the past few months, although it's a large military in terms of just sort of basic manpower, that the training is not outstanding, which is not surprising given how many resources they've devoted to training, which is not large. There is the organizations are riven with conflict because you still do have some Russian sympathetic forces in Ukraine, and the intelligence services are shot through with Russian operatives. So at the very least, and I think I read the Brookings report, and I think you have to make a better case for why this is going to work, right? Why these arms are going to be decisive than they actually did in the report, right? Because I can see, a lot of these, we don't necessarily expect Ukrainians to abandon their posts like we've seen in Iraq, but it's not impossible, right? It's not impossible that a lot of this technology will find its way to Russia, which is more sophisticated, obviously, than ISIS. But there are a lot of concerns with how decisive you can make this. Now, that said, I guess where I part a little bit of company with a lot of the critics of this position is that at some point we have to start treating Ukraine as a real country. We have to start treating Ukraine as a country that has responsibilities for defending itself and defending its territory, that should have access to weapons on the open market, just like any other country out there. And even though, and I think it's clear right now, but obviously Russians and others disagree that there's very little chance that Ukraine will find itself in NATO at any time in the future. We still have to respect the possibility that, or respect Ukraine's right to defend itself, right? And so, at some point down the road, there may be this situation where Ukraine considers buying, releasing, or somehow other acquiring this set of weapons that will likely be used against Russian separatists. Mm-hmm. And there'll be the same set of objections to selling Ukraine these weapons, right? That it's escalatory, that it implicates the United States immediately. But I struggle with the idea of giving Russia a permanent veto over Ukraine's right to establish its own self-defense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's two potentially separate issues there. I mean, one is the tactical situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine, right, where the Russians have the advantage. But in terms of the overall balance of power, the West has the structural advantage. Right. Ukraine has been lost by Putin. Putin is primarily hurting Russia in the long haul here by overstretching it, undermining its economy from within, and so on. But I think there's a separate issue, and I don't really disagree with you all that much. I mean, if I'm really talking about what Ukraine needs, they need a complete rebuilding of their army. They don't need, relatively minor technological things to cause some presumed pain on Russia at this stage in time. And that leads to the even bigger strategic question, I think, which is what does Ukraine need to be a viable state? And what they need is a massive loan from the IMF that's going to last 3 to 5 years. And this is back of the envelope talk, so I'm basing it based on my experience of looking at other Eurozone bailouts, size of economies and whatnot. But minimum, we're talking just for this year, probably another $15 billion, probably more at the end of all this, something like $30 to $50 billion. And that's going to be necessary to keep that state viable while it goes through some rather dramatic, painful economic restructuring. And that's the kind of thing that can lead to lack of cohesion in the absence of civil society. So when I hear people say, let's talk about this tactical thing to raise costs on Ukraine, one of my first thoughts is, okay, but who's going to write the check that Ukraine really needs to meet the viable objective? And I just don't see anyone lining up to write that check. So I think we have to kind of look at it as it is, not as opposed to how we wish it might be. And if no one's going to write that particular check, or we're not going to restructure their military for the long haul, then I also ask the question, is it moral, in effect, to imply to Ukraine that we're going to be something for them that we're really not? And so I agree with you that they should define their interests in terms of their independence and their foreign policy. We're also not obliged to do things that hurt our national security at the same time, because Ukraine, for example, might want to join NATO. But the point about your in that regard is, so what would be a better thing for Ukraine to have a sense of the reality of the situation to then be part of a negotiated settlement? Or should we lead them to think that we're going to be something that we're probably really not going to be? And a good example of that is this question of NATO membership for Ukraine, because everyone keeps saying it's off the table, it hasn't been on the table, and the Russians can't use that. But just recently, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO was in Georgia and on Twitter put out that this is a question that was decided in 2008, that it's a question of whether, not whether, but when those countries will join NATO. Now, if we're saying one thing privately to Putin, but the official policy is something else, then you could understand perhaps why the Russians might view that differently. Not that they're justified, they're wrong, in my opinion. But from their perspective, I mean, part of the problem is we spent a lot of time sort of telling the Russians how they should perceive their interests. So they should see this as costs and then capitulate, in effect, or negotiate, when every indicator suggests that Putin's more likely to go in the opposite direction, at least in the immediate and near term. So it's much of this debate hinges on what people think Putin may or may not do. I think we need to actually separate that out and look at the realities of the balance of power and then shape this over the long haul. I don't agree that, for example, as some say, not you, but some have said that we haven't done anything. I think the president's right. We have marshaled a very substantial political response to Russia. They have isolated themselves economically. So I think those costs are actually, over the long haul, quite high. And so the question, I think, is appropriate. The president today got asked, what would be the red line you would draw before you would give weapons to Ukraine? I thought that was the wrong question. I had the question to be, at what point do you think it would be worth risking consensus in NATO and the European Union to arm Ukraine? Because once we go down that road, then we run the serious risk of damaging that center of gravity in terms of the long-term consensus, whether it be with regards to sanctions or even support for Ukraine from the Europeans.
Right. I mean, there are a few problems here that are sort of difficult to suss out, right? I mean, one is that no matter how much you sort of see this argument made in the pages of The Nation or by John Mearsheimer or whatever, it is actually not possible for NATO to make a credible commitment not to let Georgia or Ukraine in, right? I mean, that even if right now we say, we promise we will never let Ukraine and Georgia in, and sort of then we make people repeat the statement over and over again, the Russians will never really view that as credible, right? Because they will see Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania having been in. They think incorrectly that they were promised a number of things.
Yeah, NATO would specifically have to walk back its official policy that Ukraine instead should be neutral and that it will not join NATO. But there's a disconnect between what we say the official policy is and what the reality is. And so I would ask, why would we bear a lot of unnecessary costs over something we have no intention of actually doing anyway?
Right. But and can you clarify exactly there what you're thinking about in terms of costs? What are the costs?
Well, the relative costs, I mean, by insisting on NATO's open door, for example, which is a principle and a value, which is worth, I mean, I'm not suggesting that's a bad principle or value, but it's not one we intend to do anything about. So we're not willing, in other words, so far to say, okay, NATO will now pull back that and we'll sign a piece of paper at the UN or something that locks in Ukrainian neutrality. My point there is you're absolutely right that Ukraine should define its foreign policy as it sees fit. But we also have a right to explain to Ukraine and straightforwardly what it is that our interests are at the same time, too. Our vital interests, as John Kerry said this last week, are that this crisis should de-escalate. That's different than saying Putin must lose and get out and Crimea comes back also. I mean, there's some sort of absolutist positions getting hardened in here that are not consistent with reality at this stage in time.
And the
as tragic as that is,
right, rhetorical one-upsmanship on that is really, just to sort of digress a little bit, the rhetorical one-upsmanship on that is really interesting, right? I mean, everyone knows that Crimea will never be returned, right? That you could have a regime change in Russia tomorrow and Putin could be thrown out by the masses and Crimea is deeply unlikely to return, right? And so, but sort of how that claim sort of plays out in this conversation is very interesting. But at the same time, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the sort of any NATO promise to whether the Russians would believe any NATO promise to keep Ukraine neutral, whether we would believe that neutrality is even something that the Russians actually want out of Ukraine at this point, right? And that's actually something that deeply frustrated me about the John Mearsheimer editorial on this today, where he proposed, let's make Ukraine into a buffer state. Right? And it's not obvious that Russia wants a buffer state, right? It seems more likely to me that Russia wants something much closer to Belarus in this situation, which is essential control over, or effective control, an effective veto over the political arrangements that are in Kiev.
Right? Which they're by and large able to achieve by relative minimal status quo in eastern Ukraine right now. So in other words, they don't necessarily need to do much more. But if they think weapons are coming in that could damage that actually incentivizes them to do even further, or to harden these gains and consolidate them. The flip side, I understand your point well, but I mean, we think about a year and a half ago, Putin had all that
right
in Ukraine.
Right.
And the West wasn't freaking out.
Right.
He lost Ukraine. I mean, I'm always amazed that isn't like us. Putin has lost Ukraine. He's been acting reactively. I mean, the idea that this is like the strong Russian Empire is being rebuilt, I actually think that that's an important point of departure on this issue, because if anything, it looks to me more like the ongoing sporadic consequences of the collapse of the Russian Empire, which left 20 plus million people outside of Russia's border when the state collapsed. Mm-hmm. And that's just been a persistent, festering issue for a very long time. And we really haven't been addressing it in any sustained way. For example, like building up OSCE capacity or that sort of thing. And instead we responded with NATO promises to Ukraine, which we had no intention of fulfilling in 2008. And what happened after that? The Russians invaded Georgia. I'm not one to I do part company on this question of the taproot of the cause of the problem. I mean, the problem here is Putin. Okay, the Ukrainians didn't ask for this. They don't deserve what they're getting by any means. And the West was legitimately trying to use the institutions it had to consolidate peace and security in Europe after the Cold War. So I think you can concede on the NATO enlargement thing that the criticisms of the first round and the second round, including the Baltics, did not go all haywire like a lot of people anticipated they might. Now, one of the problems with those rounds of enlargement, though, is that they were almost purely political. Right. They did not think hard about what it would really mean to defend the Baltic countries, if we ever really had to have that conversation. And instead, it was sort of kicked down the road. And people like me at the time in the 90s felt, well, okay, if you're going to do that, you better have that discussion now, because the worst time is in the middle of a crisis where security dilemmas are high, that you need to start doing those things.
Well, I mean, people are free to judge the magnitude of threats and the magnitude of deterrent threats that are necessary to manage those, right?
And what the evidence suggests is that the Allies do not consider Russia to be an overwhelming threat, if you follow the money, if you follow the military capabilities and things like that. So in that sense, we want to be careful not to play into that in a linear way which actually would allow Putin. I mean, Putin may do what he'll do anyway, so I don't know that you're wrong, in that sense. Maybe it wouldn't backfire to put the weapons, and maybe he would recalculate. But again, given I just don't think this is a debate about whether we should intervene in the Balkans or not. This is whether we should intervene in the backyard of a country with nuclear weapons.
Right, and I don't think we disagree on this point. Although it's an interesting phrasing you just put there, right? In the backyard of, right? That grants Russia sort of a more of a possessive over Ukraine and over the countries that are around it than I'm comfortable with, right? And that I think people should be comfortable with, right? And people, sort of come back. How does the United States react when a country like Russia puts weapons, 90 miles off Florida? Well, we overreact. We react badly, and we overreact, and we go a little bit crazy.
And that's what the Russians are. There's no.
That's what the Russians are doing. But
that's why I think the point is, the people really being hurt here, in the long run, are going to be the Russians.
Right.
And Putin is the one doing that to them.
Right.
And that's going to require a steady, long-term we don't know where that tipping point is, where Putin decides, okay, the diminishing returns, I've got to take the exit strategy. But again, I fully concede much of this hinges on, what people think is the core root of the conflict. But that's why I try to stay focused on capabilities. And again, they have tactical advantage in eastern Ukraine. There's very little militarily that we can do that will change that dynamic. We might hope that it could raise the costs and lead them to negotiate, but the relative risks of alternative outcomes, in my opinion, don't outweigh those potential benefits.
So, I mean, sort of like I was trying to do before, what if we drag this time frame out and we look at this for 3 to 5 years and we make some powerful assumptions about what Ukrainian politics look like and what Russian activity is going to be? But, it's not hard to envision this future where the Russian-occupied states now are, effectively frozen states, right? We've had this story before, right? It's not an uncommon Russian diplomatic tactic in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even if we keep NATO expansion to Ukraine off the table, and I don't think we need to formally do that in any sense, because I don't think you could ever convince. There's too much division in NATO to
nobody in NATO. But that's part of the problem. Why is the Deputy Secretary General out then saying that it is? Official policy?
Because the Secretariat has, as with many institutions, the Secretariat has different interests than the members, right? But so what does this look like 3 to 5 years out, right? How much, whether you want to phrase it as respect for Russia's backyard or how much, sort of fear of Russia in its immediate core, or whether you want to say it in terms of how much do we want to recognize Russia's status in its near abroad? Like, what sort of veto do we accord over our relations with countries like Ukraine or, a country like, or Georgia, right? Georgia is a country like Ukraine. It's sort of in a different place, but it's a country like Ukraine. So, I mean, even if we grant these sort of short-term tactical problems with granting weapons to Ukraine, there's going to come a time where everybody gets invited to the party, and the party being, a variety of different military exercises doing this or that or the other. And do we disinvite Ukraine out of respect for Russia's feelings on this problem, right? How much do we keep them on the outside just because Russia doesn't like them?
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to answer that, but let me complicate it a little bit further, because part of the dilemma here is that the Russians hold a lot of cards, actually, on a number of key areas of mutual involvement that we have even perhaps more interests at stake, and in particular Iran, but not just Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, North Korea. Even if you want to go bigger, climate change. I mean, there are issue after issue that we are going to have cooperation with the Russians on. So, whether we can walk and chew gum at the same time will be a very interesting dynamic. Part of what worries me if I game this out over the coming years is that we also run the risk of both sides having mutual escalating sort of domestic spirals in which it becomes, sort of a posturing race to the sea kind of scenario where each side has to look tougher, each side responds to the other, and then we're in a dilemma that hurts nobody except the Ukrainians that are getting killed in the middle. And so, at the end of the day, I think your question is the right one, but I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, we're talking about defeating 19th century power politics with 21st century belief in institutions and values and principles, and ironically, that's where the case comes up about making Russia pay costs. But I think you can make Russia. I think you have to make Russia pay costs because you've got to send a message, for example, to China too. That there are costs, to annexing other pieces of land. So that's significant. That is an existential interest that's involved here. But I also think we're doing that. I think the political isolation, the economic isolation, the potential for ratcheting up sanctions are significant. But when you go down that military route, again, as Henry Kissinger said, 300 miles from the capital of Russia, it's just a very different set of circumstances. So I agree with you with your principled point. It's a very sound one. But we also have to take into consideration the practical realities of what are we going to do or what are we going to do next, and what costs are we willing to bear, incidentally. And that's why I think that's really important, especially in terms of the relationship with the allies, because Russia has a second strike when it comes to economic pain. With regard to energy supplies. And the allies know that. The Eurozone is still, in my opinion, the number one strategic instability in the European area. And again, I think that the evidence is that the states are behaving as if they think that's the case because they're not offering the money and they want diplomacy to solve this conflict. And so I think we also have to shape this debate not only in terms of all the different things that we think would be good and normative and right to do, but as scholars, I think we also have to explain why things are happening the way they are, and then perhaps states should adjust their interest according to that.
So I guess what's bothering me about the way you're framing this is it seems like you want to go half realist, right? I feel like you're the half realist here, right? And so you either go no realist or you go full realist, right? I mean, it seems like the full realist would be like Ukraine, and why bother making Russia pay costs on this issue when Ukraine itself is not that big of a deal? So why bother, breaking up all of these other potential relationships we have with Russia in counterterror, in climate, in economics, and North Korea, all of these other places where we sort of have significant or are needing of significant Russian influence. Afghanistan, right? The future of Afghanistan. If we could give Afghanistan back to the Russians, that would be great, right? Come on, you can come back. So if I'm going to take seriously your argument here, and I do take seriously your argument, I shouldn't. Then why do this sort of half measures of trying to, and Russia is going to feel significant pain, right? I mean, it's gonna have 5% contraction in its economy. That's pain that is unknown to Americans. Of course, our ability to make others feel pain is largely unknown to Americans, but
and the willingness of Russians to sustain pain too for a long time is also well documented.
Although we don't, it's one thing to sustain pain, when you're directly fearing a Nazi invasion, right? It'll be an interesting question.
Yeah.
Popular Putin is next year and how much.
I'm not I dabbled in Soviet studies back in the day, and what always stood out to me was these public opinion polls that showed lots of support for the regime, but people would go home and put their religious icon up and they would have their personal lives and curse the regime to all hell. And I have a feeling that there's probably a significant more of that going on in Russia than we realize at this point. The question is, how long and patient are we willing to be in that regard? But, part of I accept the critique, because part of my argument, including in my new book, is that at least for American national security, it has worked best when we have a balance between sort of what we would like to see happen and the realities of the situation, between our ideals and our realism. And the problem is when we get off kilter in one direction or the other. And so I guess that's probably what I've been maybe sort of leaning on, sort of the more realist case here. But I'm also sympathetic to the points being made that you've made and that others made. But also, maybe some of that has to do with having spent some time in Washington too, and seen how these things, if you want to win something politically, I suppose, I think one has to be relatively focused. I've seen it, we've seen it happen where, for example, Washington got so far ahead of the public on bombing Syria in 2013. I mean, I think people were genuinely surprised that the country wasn't with them. And I think part of that is a consequence of 20 years of liberal interventionists and neoconservatives dominating the debate.
Only having a conversation with each other and not really
having a conversation with each other and steamrolling people who raise hard questions about these things. And regrettably, that's how you end up in Iraq or surging into Afghanistan with bad assumptions and so on, the war in Libya, et cetera. I mean, it astonishes me, to be honest, that after everything we've been through, that we would start a debate without asking these questions like what happens next when we're diving headfirst into a conflagration involving Russia. Yeah, I mean, to me, the stakes are so much dramatically higher even than Iraq. I'm not saying this is the outcome, but I think the potential for this to be strategically catastrophic is high. So we need to factor that into our analysis. And I guess what I'm saying is what kind of surprised me in this debate is that the advocates of this just literally seemed uninterested in those questions. And I was surprised by the Brookings document because there's plenty of people at Brookings that have a very different view. And so I felt like they had an obligation to these issues to at least answer and address some of these concerns, but instead they're sort of waved aside as if they're not important. And I saw how that happened in the run-up to the Kosovo War. I saw it in the NATO enlargement debates. We've seen it in the Iraq debates. And, these are significant issues. And so I think my point is these are all need to be at the table. And the good news is I think the president has insisted they all be at the table. And I think he seems, at least from my point of view, very attuned to one of his core rationales of being president is that we should listen to our allies. And our allies are telling us right now they think arming Ukraine is a very bad idea and counterproductive.
Listening to our allies is part of what got us sucked into Libya, though, right? So it's not always a great thing, as you know.
Well, but that's a classic case, though, of okay, what happens after? Even in that case, what happens after you succeed?
Right.
And part of the dilemma is if you're not willing to secure a peace, then what have you accomplished? If you're not willing to spend the money to really build Ukraine in the way I think you rightly described, then what are we doing? What are we selling the Ukrainians? It's setting them up for very serious disappointment. It's a false promise, in effect. If we're not serious about it, we have to, in my view, follow the money. I think following the money tells us where the interests are. Right now, I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that there's, including in the United States, despite the rhetoric, I don't see John McCain, I don't see Hillary Clinton, I don't see others saying we need to write that check. The American taxpayer needs to write that check.
Right, and I doubt. I thought it was very interesting how, to the extent to which Mitt Romney tried to make Russia an issue in 2012 and failed, it will be easier in 2016 to make Russia an issue, obviously, and so it will be worth watching, especially on the Republican side. But also, well, it may not even be a Democratic primary, so that may not be relevant. But especially on the Republican side, how that plays out and sort of what rhetorical commitments it breeds. In terms of what the election is going to look like on that side, and then how the Russia conversation will play out in the general election.
I've been very careful on this to at least personally to try to keep the assumptions about politics out of it, because I don't want to sound like I would be questioning the motives of people that I have great respect for, and I do respect the people that have done the Brookings study, and I've listened carefully to their arguments. I just think it's very risky what they're saying. I think the thing that worries me, like I said, is that this turns into a cycle of posturing at the domestic level for both parties, and that can lead to outcomes that were unnecessary. If some arrangement is achievable that will stop people from getting killed in Ukraine, then that's probably the first order of business. And the second order of business is the United States needs to be very careful about entangling itself. You rightly question the notion, but in the backyard of a flailing, declining, unpredictable, paranoid country armed with nuclear weapons.
I guess some of the stuff you sort of And this came through also a lot in the Mearsheimer piece. It's obvious to us that we can take steps which would enable or embolden the Kiev government to escalate the situation in really unnecessary and probably destructive ways. But what view do you have of our ability to restrain the Kiev government, right? The Kiev government has pretty good reasons to want its territory back and to want to shut down the current Russian offensive. And although we understand that on the United States side, it's absurd that people are talking about that we have to push Putin out and send him to Ukraine. I read Gary Kasparov's Twitter feed, and I love Gary. I'm a chess player, and Gary Kasparov is one of my heroes, and he has really fantastic reasons for hating the Russian government. But he also says absurd things about how we cannot hold to any half measures where they're not going to give back Ukraine and so forth. But it's much easier to tell a neocon here in the United States, this is absurd, you're never going to get Crimea back. I think it's harder to tell that to the government in Kiev, right?
Oh,
Which
sure.
is,
Yeah.
have them listen to that, right?
Yeah, but they also they're again, structurally there's a bigger question for them than Eastern Ukraine, which is their economy viable or not? And so that's why I think you see Ann Applebaum, for example, in the Washington Post today, kind of dismissing the whole debate about arming Ukraine as almost irrelevant if these other issues aren't really being tackled. And so I think she's right about that. But I also am pessimistic that anyone's actually serious about doing that. Right. But I actually
Ukraine's best. How about could I phrase that as Ukraine's best revenge is living well?
Well, that would be, in my opinion, that's the way. The biggest existential threat here to Putin is not NATO. I mean, in my opinion, I think we're making a mistake if we think that isn't an important issue to him and his people. But that said, the biggest challenge to Putin here is that Ukraine would be a successful model of an economic story that people in Russia might actually start to say, hey, we want some of that too. So that's why I said, sort of domestic spiral going on here. But I'd also ask you, though, too, even on the arming thing, and I'd really like to know what you think. But what happens when we do this and it supposedly raises the costs and Russia doubles down? I mean, even if they think the weapons are coming, that could incentivize them to just really clamp down hard, and then negotiated options are off the table. And then we're on the hook for everything else too. Except we won't necessarily have the allies with us, because they'll be like, hey, you Americans, went off on your own. So you can take care of the money, you can pay for it, et cetera, et cetera. So my question then is the same one I would bring back to the Brookings people is, okay, we do that. And then the problem is what happens next? Because now our credibility is on the line. And once our credibility is on the line, we know we have to win, right? So then it's zero-sum game.
It matters, right? And in the end, it sort of comes down to literally what would we do if there were simply armored spearheads headed towards Kiev? And part of the answer is probably nothing, right? Because there's nothing we can't, even if we ship a few anti-tank weapons to them, there's probably nothing we can do that's useful for this scenario. Right?
I also think, though, that the Russians are very overstretched, actually, as it is. And so I think that, strategically, repeating that thing that the president said today, that, it's ultimately the Russians that are being hurt by Putin's actions here. I mean, that may not get through, of course, in the Russian media, but with time it will, and so I think that the question is whether we're in this for the long haul, or we think there's some kind of quick fix. And we didn't try the quick fix. The quick fix would have been taking the NATO thing off the table, right, formally. And making a deal like on the Cuban Missile Crisis, as a way to de-escalate and have a long-term architecture and agreement. We have held on to that position. And yet, as I said, we signaled something very different. So now we are where we are. But at the end of the day, again, my worry is, okay, when that doesn't succeed, then the pressure will be, we must do more. We must now escalate. And I also don't know how you actually deliver these weapons, even through Poland or the Baltics or something else, and train the Ukrainians. We're talking about relatively sophisticated things that will not even be in place for 6 months to a year. So the assumption of the Brookings thing was that this technology had to be in place within a couple months if it was going to make any difference. So again, I mean, we can't just drop highly sophisticated weaponry in the middle of a military that's not trained in terms of using them. I mean, that's a process in that, and it takes time.
All right. Well, I'm just going to conclude by saying I agree with you, but I don't want to agree with you.
Well, that's all right. I feel the same way. I don't want to agree with me either, but you know.
Well, for Entanglements viewers, thank you, and we'll try to amp up our production schedule over the next few weeks. And John, thank you for coming on again.
Thanks for having me. Thanks. It's fun.